On December 13, 1937, the gates of Nanking fell, the Chinese capital, seat of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, a city of over 1 million people, home to ancient temples and modern boulevards, had been under siege for days. Japanese aircraft had bombed it relentlessly. Japanese artillery had pounded its walls. Now Japanese infantry poured through the breaches, and what followed would become one of the most horrific atrocities in modern history. The soldiers who entered Nanking were not following orders to commit an atrocity. They were following something worse, the absence of orders to prevent it. The Japanese command had issued no instructions for the treatment of prisoners, no guidelines for civilian protection, and no framework for occupation. The soldiers, brutalized by months of hard fighting, maddened by the deaths of comrades, drunk on victory and alcohol, were given a city to do with as they pleased. What they did defied belief. Over the next 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers murdered Chinese prisoners of war by the thousands, machine-gunned in ditches, bayoneted in pits, beheaded for sport, burned alive in buildings. They raped women of all ages, grandmothers, mothers, young girls, in numbers that staggered comprehension. Conservative estimates place the number of rapes at 20,000. Some historians believe the figure was far higher. They looted homes, temples, and businesses. They burned neighborhoods to the ground. They shot civilians for entertainment, used prisoners for bayonet practice, and held killing contests that were reported in Japanese newspapers as if they were sporting events. When it was over, perhaps 200,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were dead. Some estimates run as high as 300,000. The true number will never be known, because so many bodies were dumped in the Yangtze River, burned in mass cremations, or buried in unmarked graves. The International Safety Zone, established by a handful of Western businessmen and missionaries who stayed behind to protect civilians, saved perhaps 250,000 lives. But its members witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member who led the Safety Zone Committee, wrote in his diary, "You cannot imagine the brutality and inhumanity of the Japanese soldiers. It is beyond all understanding. Coming from a member of the Nazi Party, this was a damning indictment indeed." But the Rape of Nanking was not the beginning of Japan's war in Asia. It was merely its most infamous moment. The war had begun 6 years earlier in the frozen plains of Manchuria, when a group of Japanese army officers decided to manufacture an incident that would justify conquest. And it would not end until atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, until Emperor Hirohito broadcast his surrender to a stunned nation, until the empire that Japanese militarists had built across Asia lay in ruin. This is the story of Japan's long war in Asia. The war that began before Pearl Harbor, before the invasion of Poland, before most Americans and Europeans were aware that a world war was coming. It is the story of how a rising power, driven by ideology and desperation, launched a campaign of conquest that would ultimately destroy it. This is the story of the war that consumed Asia for 14 years and left tens of millions dead. To understand how Japan came to invade China, to establish a puppet state in Manchuria, to march on Nanking and commit the atrocities that followed, we must first understand the forces that drove Japanese expansion. Japan in the early 20th century was a nation of contradictions. It had transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern industrial power in barely 2 generations. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had launched a revolution from above that remade Japanese society. By 1905, Japan had defeated Russia in war, the first Asian nation to defeat a European great power in modern times. By 1920, Japan had become one of the 5 permanent members of the League of Nations Council, recognized as a world power with interests spanning East Asia and the Pacific. But Japan's power rested on fragile foundations. The island nation was poor in natural resources. It had to import most of its oil, iron, rubber, and other raw materials essential for modern industry and military power. Its population was growing rapidly, pressing against the limits of what the home islands could support. Its economy was vulnerable to disruption, dependent on trade with nations that might one day become enemies. Japanese leaders looked at their situation and drew conclusions that would prove catastrophic. They saw the Western colonial powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, the United States, controlling vast empires across Asia, extracting resources and wealth from subject peoples. They saw China, weak and divided, its resources ripe for exploitation. They concluded that Japan's survival required expansion, that Japan must build its own empire or be reduced to a second-rate power at the mercy of others. This imperial vision found its most systematic expression in the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a Japanese-dominated order that would supposedly liberate Asia from Western colonialism while providing Japan with the resources and markets it needed. In practice, Japanese imperialism would prove as brutal and exploitative as any Western colonialism, if not more so. But the ideology justified expansion and resonated with genuine resentment of Western dominance in Asia. The military, which held enormous power in the Japanese constitutional system, was the driving force behind expansion. Under the Meiji Constitution, the Army and Navy reported directly to the Emperor, bypassing the civilian cabinet. The service ministers had to be active duty officers, giving the military a veto over any government. If the services refused to nominate ministers, no cabinet could be formed. This structural arrangement meant that aggressive policies favored by the military were difficult to resist. Within the military, factions competed for influence. The control faction Tosia advocated for gradual expansion under careful planning, building Japan's strength before confronting the Western powers. The Imperial Way faction Kodoa called for more aggressive action, driven by radical nationalism and a mystical devotion to the emperor. Both factions agreed on the goal of the empire. They differed, however, on the timing and method. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, radicalized Japanese politics and strengthened the hand of the militarists. Japan's economy, heavily dependent on exports of silk and other goods, was devastated by the collapse in global trade. Unemployment soared. Farmers lost their land. Young officers, many from rural backgrounds, watched their families suffer and blamed the civilian politicians who seemed incapable of addressing the crisis. They looked to expansion as the solution. Seize Manchuria with its coal, iron, and agricultural land, and Japan's problems would be solved. This was the context in which a group of officers in the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force stationed in Manchuria to protect Japan's railway and commercial interest, decided to manufacture a crisis. The Manchurian Incident of September 18, 1931, was one of the most consequential acts of military insubordination in modern history. A small group of Kwantung Army officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Ishiwara and Colonel Saishiro Itagaki, planned and executed an operation that would set Japan on the path to total war. They did so without authorization from Tokyo, knowing that their government would be presented with a fait accompli and would have to accept it. At 10:20 p.m. on September 18th, a small explosive charge detonated on the tracks of the South Manchuria Railway near the city of Mukden, now Shenyang. The damage was minimal. A train passed over the spot minutes later without difficulty, but the explosion provided the pretext that the conspirators needed. Within minutes, Japanese soldiers began attacking the nearby Chinese garrison, claiming they were responding to Chinese sabotage. Within hours, fighting had spread across Mukden. Within days, the Kwantung Army had seized the city and was advancing across Manchuria. Within months, all of Manchuria, an area larger than France and Germany combined, was under Japanese control. The civilian government in Tokyo was horrified. Prime Minister Riejiro Wakatsuki and Foreign Minister Kijiro Shidara had been pursuing a policy of international cooperation, seeking to resolve disputes with China through negotiation. The Manchurian Incident made a mockery of their efforts. But when they tried to halt the military's advance, they discovered they were powerless. The army simply ignored their orders. The Emperor, Hirohito, was informed of the incident and the army's unauthorized action. His role in what followed has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue that Hirohito was a figurehead who could not control his military. Others, including Herbert Bix in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, argue that Hirohito was an active participant in Japanese expansion, approving operations and failing to restrain the military when he had the power to do so. What is clear is that Hirohito did not stop the Manchurian operation. Whether he could not or would not, the result was the same. The army acted with impunity, and Japan's course was set. China appealed to the League of Nations, which dispatched a commission of inquiry under Lord Lytton. The Lytton Commission spent months investigating, interviewing witnesses, and examining evidence. Its report, published in October 1932, concluded that Japan's claims of Chinese aggression were false, that the Manchurian operation had been planned and executed by the Japanese military, and that Japan should withdraw. The League of Nations adopted the Lytton Report in February 1933. The Japanese delegation, led by Yosuke Matsuoka, walked out of the assembly. On March 27, 1933, Japan formally withdrew from the League of Nations. It was the first time a major power had defied the League and suffered no consequences. The lesson was not lost on other potential aggressors. In Rome, Benito Mussolini took note. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler, who had just become Chancellor of Germany, observed that the international community would condemn aggression but would not act to reverse it. The failure to stop Japan in Manchuria was the first great failure of collective security. It would not be the last. In Manchuria, the Japanese created a puppet state that would serve as a model for their future conquests. Manchukuo, as the new state was called, was proclaimed on March 1, 1932. It was nominally independent, with its own government, its own flag, its own currency. Its head of state was Puyi, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, who had been deposed as a child in 1912 and had been living in obscurity. The Japanese installed him as chief executive and later as emperor of Manchukuo, a title that gave the regime a veneer of legitimacy. In reality, Manchukuo was a Japanese colony in all but name. Japanese advisors controlled every ministry. Japanese officers commanded the military. Japanese businesses dominated the economy. The Kwantung Army maintained order and suppressed any resistance with brutal efficiency. Chinese and Korean inhabitants were subjected to forced labor, cultural suppression, and systematic exploitation. The Japanese poured resources into developing Manchukuo. They built railways, factories, mines, and cities. They exploited the region's coal and iron to feed Japan's industrial machine. They settled Japanese farmers on land confiscated from Chinese owners. They conducted agricultural experiments, built hydroelectric dams, and established research facilities, including Unit 700, which conducted horrific biological warfare experiments on human subjects. For Japanese militarists, Manchukuo was proof that expansion worked. It provided resources, space for settlement, and strategic depth against the Soviet Union to the north. If Japan could do this in Manchuria, why not in the rest of China? Why not throughout Asia? But the conquest of Manchuria also had costs that the militarists ignored or dismissed. It alienated the Western powers, who saw Japanese expansion as a threat to their own interests in China. It strengthened Chinese nationalism, unifying factions that had been fighting each other in opposition to Japanese aggression. And it created a precedent for military insubordination that would plague Japanese governance throughout the 1930s. If the army could seize Manchuria without authorization, what else might it do? The answer came on the morning of February 26, 1936. At approximately 5:00 a.m., over 1,400 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, led by young officers affiliated with the Imperial Way faction, launched a coup attempt in Tokyo. They seized key government buildings, attacked the residences of senior officials, and called for a Showa restoration that would sweep away the corrupt politicians and restore direct imperial rule. The rebels succeeded in assassinating several prominent figures. Finance Minister Korkyo Takahashi, who had opposed excessive military spending, was shot and hacked to death in his bed. Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Makoto Sato was killed along with his wife. Inspector General of Military Education Jotaro Watanabe was shot dead. Prime Minister Keisuke Okada escaped only because the rebels killed his brother-in-law by mistake, believing him to be the prime minister. For 3 days, Tokyo was paralyzed. The rebel soldiers occupied the center of the city. The army leadership was divided. Many senior officers sympathized with the rebels' goals, if not their methods. It seemed possible that the coup might succeed, that Japan's already fragile civilian government might be overthrown entirely. Emperor Hirohito's response was decisive. He was furious that soldiers had murdered his advisors and thrown the capital into chaos. He made clear that the rebellion must be suppressed, that the officers must surrender, that there would be no negotiation. "They have killed my advisors," he reportedly said. "They are traitors." Faced with the emperor's unambiguous opposition, the rebellion collapsed. On February 29th, the rebel soldiers stood down. The leaders were arrested, court-martialed, and executed. The Imperial Way faction was discredited and purged from the army. But the February 26 incident had lasting consequences. The control faction, which had defeated the rebels, emerged stronger than ever. The incident demonstrated that the military could act with impunity in foreign adventures. The Manchurian Incident officers had been treated leniently, but could not challenge the emperor's authority at home. The lesson was clear: expansion abroad was acceptable. Domestic upheaval was not. The incident also strengthened the military's grip on government. Civilian politicians, shaken by the assassinations, became even more reluctant to oppose the army. The service minister's active duty requirement was reinforced, ensuring that the military retained its veto over cabinets. The path to democracy was closed. The path to war was open. The war in China proper began on July 7, 1937, with another manufactured incident. Japanese and Chinese troops had been stationed in proximity near Beijing since the Boxer Protocol of 1901, which had given foreign powers the right to station troops in the area to protect their legations. Tensions were high. Provocations and clashes were common. Both sides were on edge. On the night of July 7th, Japanese troops conducting exercises near the Marco Polo Bridge Luguchao claimed that one of their soldiers was missing. They demanded to search the nearby town of Wamping for him. The Chinese garrison commander refused. Shots were fired, by whom is still disputed. The fighting escalated. The missing soldier, Private Shimura Kikujiro, had in fact temporarily left his unit to relieve himself. He returned safely within hours. But by then, the incident had taken on a life of its own. Unlike the Manchurian Incident, the Marco Polo Bridge incident does not appear to have been a carefully planned provocation. It was more likely a local clash that spiraled out of control. But the Japanese military was looking for an excuse to expand its control in northern China, and this incident provided it. Rather than negotiating a settlement, the Japanese army poured reinforcements into the area. The civilian government in Tokyo, under Prime Minister Fumimaro Kano, initially hoped to contain the conflict, but the military was determined to expand it. Within weeks, Japanese forces had seized Beijing and Tianjin. The war that Japanese leaders insisted was not a war. They called it the China Incident to avoid legal complications, had begun in earnest. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader who had spent years consolidating his control over China, faced a terrible choice. He had been fighting the communists under Mao Zedong for a decade, and he believed that internal unity must precede resistance to Japan. But the Marco Polo Bridge incident, following the kidnapping and coercion he had experienced during the Xi'an incident of 1936, forced his hand. Public opinion demanded resistance. The communists, under the terms of the United Front Agreement, promised to join the fight against Japan. Chiang committed China to war. In August 1937, fighting erupted in Shanghai, China's largest city and commercial center. Chiang deliberately expanded the war to Shanghai, hoping to draw in the Western powers whose interests were concentrated there. He committed his best German-trained divisions to the battle, determined to show that China could fight. The Battle of Shanghai lasted 3 months and was one of the bloodiest urban battles in history. Japanese naval forces bombarded the city. Japanese troops, initially repelled by fierce Chinese resistance, gradually gained ground through superior firepower and reinforcements. Chinese forces fought with extraordinary courage, suffering perhaps 250,000 casualties, including the cream of Chiang's modernized army. Japanese casualties exceeded 40,000. Shanghai fell in November 1937. The road to Nanking lay open. The Rape of Nanking has been the subject of historical controversy, particularly in Japan, where some nationalists have denied or minimized the atrocities. But the evidence, from contemporary observers, from Japanese soldiers' own diaries and testimonies, from photographic records from Chinese survivors, is overwhelming. Japanese forces approached Nanjing in early December 1937. The city was China's capital, though the government had already relocated to Wuhan. Its symbolic importance was enormous. Approximately 90,000 Chinese soldiers remained to defend it, though many were demoralized remnants of units shattered at Shanghai. General Yuan Matsui, commanding Japanese forces, ordered the city to be taken. What he did not order, and what he later claimed he did not sanction, was the systematic atrocities that followed. The assault began on December 9th. By December 12th, Chinese defenses were collapsing. General Tang Shengzhe, the defense commander, fled the city, leaving his troops without leadership. Panic spread. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms and tried to blend in with civilians. Thousands crowded the waterfront, desperate to escape across the Yangtze. Japanese troops entered the city on December 13th. What followed was 6 weeks of horror. Chinese prisoners of war were systematically massacred. The Japanese command had neither the facilities nor the inclination to take prisoners. Thousands were machine-gunned in groups. Others were marched to the banks of the Yangtze and shot, their bodies falling into the river. Still others were used for bayonet practice, beheaded in killing contests, burned alive, or buried alive. The methods of killing were limited only by the imaginations of the perpetrators. The treatment of civilians was equally horrific. Japanese soldiers went door to door, looting, burning, and killing. Men of military age were particularly targeted. They might be soldiers in disguise, but the killing was not limited to men. Women, children, and the elderly were murdered as well. The sexual violence was systematic and pervasive. Soldiers raped women in their homes, in the streets, in the refugee camps. Some victims were raped repeatedly by multiple soldiers. Many were killed afterward to eliminate witnesses. Others were taken as comfort women, forced into sexual slavery. The violence was not hidden or punished. It was openly tolerated and even encouraged. Foreign nationals in Nanking, businessmen, missionaries, doctors, professors, established the International Safety Zone, a designated area where civilians could seek refuge. The committee that ran the zone, led by John Rabe, and including Americans like Surgeon Robert Wilson and missionary Minnie Vautrin, worked desperately to protect those who sought shelter. They confronted Japanese soldiers, documented atrocities, and saved tens of thousands of lives. Their testimonies, recorded in diaries and letters, provide some of the most damning evidence of what occurred. Rabe, who used his status as a Nazi Party member to protect Chinese from Japanese soldiers, filled his diary with accounts of murder, rape, and destruction. Wilson performed surgery around the clock on victims of Japanese violence. Vautrin sheltered thousands of women and girls at Jinling College, repeatedly confronting soldiers who tried to drag them away. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, would later estimate the death toll at over 200,000 civilians and prisoners of war. Some historians believe the number was higher. The exact figure will never be known. General Matsui was executed as a war criminal in 1948, but he was only one of many who bore responsibility. The emperor was informed of the atrocities, but took no action to stop them or punish the perpetrators. The culture of the Japanese military, which dehumanized the enemy and glorified violence, created the conditions in which the massacre could occur. The Rape of Nanking was not an aberration. It was the logical outcome of an ideology that viewed the Chinese as subhuman. The massacre at Nanking shocked the world, but it did not change the course of the war. Japan continued its advance, seizing more Chinese territory, establishing more puppet governments, and committing more atrocities. The war ground on, month after month, year after year. Japan won every major battle, but could not win the war. This was China's strategy, trading space for time, retreating into the interior, refusing to surrender, waiting for Japan to exhaust itself. Chiang Kai-shek moved his capital first to Wuhan, then to Chongqing, deep in the mountainous interior, beyond the reach of Japanese ground forces. He lost the coast, the cities, the richest provinces, but he kept China in the war. The Japanese called their operations pacification campaigns. They launched offensive after offensive, expecting each one to be decisive. Each time they seized territory, captured cities, inflicted heavy casualties, and found that the Chinese had retreated, regrouped, and continued fighting elsewhere. The war that was supposed to last 3 months stretched into years. The scale of the conflict was staggering. By 1939, Japan had deployed over 1 million troops in China. Casualties mounted on both sides, hundreds of thousands killed, millions wounded, countless civilians dead from bombing, starvation, and disease. The war consumed resources that Japan desperately needed. It tied down forces that could not be used elsewhere, and it generated international condemnation that gradually isolated Japan from the world community. The United States, in particular, grew increasingly hostile. American public opinion, already sympathetic to China, was inflamed by reports of Japanese atrocities. The bombing of Chinese cities, including the accidental strafing of the American gunboat USS Panay on the Yangtze River in December 1937, brought the war home to Americans. The Panay incident killed 3 American sailors and wounded dozens more. Japan apologized and paid compensation, but the damage to relations was done. President Franklin Roosevelt, constrained by isolationist sentiment at home, began searching for ways to aid China and pressure Japan without going to war. In 1939, he gave notice that the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan would be terminated, opening the way for economic sanctions. In 1940, he imposed restrictions on exports of aviation fuel and scrap metal to Japan. The economic noose was beginning to tighten. Meanwhile, in China, the war took on new dimensions. The uneasy alliance between Chiang's nationalists and Mao's communists frayed under the pressure of conflict. Both sides spent as much energy fighting each other, or preparing to fight each other after the war, as they did fighting the Japanese. The communists used the war to expand their base areas in the countryside, building the foundations for their eventual victory in 1949. The nationalists grew weaker, more corrupt, and more dependent on American aid that never seemed to be enough. The Japanese, meanwhile, grew more brutal. Unable to defeat China conventionally, they resorted to terror. The three-alls policy, kill all, burn all, loot all, was applied to areas suspected of supporting resistance. Biological weapons were deployed, spreading plague and cholera among the Chinese populations. Chemical weapons were used repeatedly. The war became a campaign of extermination. The war in Europe transformed the strategic situation in Asia. When Germany invaded France in May 1940 and achieved victory in 6 weeks, the colonial order in Asia was suddenly vulnerable. France, now occupied, could not defend its colonies in Indochina. The Netherlands, also occupied, could not defend the Dutch East Indies. Britain, fighting for its survival, could spare few resources for its Asian possessions. Japan saw an opportunity. The southern resource area, Indochina, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, contained the oil, rubber, tin, and other resources that Japan desperately needed. With the European colonial powers weakened or defeated, these territories seemed ripe for the taking. In September 1940, Japan pressured the Vichy French government to allow Japanese troops to occupy northern Indochina. The French, helpless to resist, complied. Japanese forces moved in, gaining bases that threatened both China and the European colonies to the south. The same month, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, formally creating the Axis alliance. The pact was directed primarily against the United States. It committed the signatories to assist each other if any of them were attacked by a power not currently involved in the European war or the war in China. The message to Washington was clear. If the United States entered the war against any Axis power, it would face all three. The United States responded by escalating its economic pressure. In July 1941, after Japan occupied southern Indochina, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States and imposed a complete embargo on oil exports to Japan. Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. Suddenly, Japan was cut off from the oil supplies on which its economy and military depended. The Japanese military calculated that Japan had approximately 2 years of oil reserves. After that, the fleet would be immobilized, the Air Force grounded, the economy paralyzed. Japan faced a stark choice: abandon its imperial ambitions and withdraw from China, or seize the resources of Southeast Asia by force, which would mean war with the United States. In Tokyo, the debate raged through the summer and fall of 1941. The Navy, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, knew that Japan could not win a prolonged war with the United States. American industrial capacity was too great. But if Japan struck quickly, seized the resources it needed, and established a defensive perimeter, perhaps the Americans would tire of the conflict and negotiate a settlement. It was a desperate gamble, born of desperation. The alternative: retreat, humiliation, the abandonment of everything Japan had fought for, was unthinkable to the militarists who controlled the government. They chose war. The men who led Japan toward war with the United States were products of a system that valued military service above all else. General Hideki Tojo, who became prime minister in October 1941, was the face of Japanese militarism. A career army officer, Tojo had served in Manchuria, had been chief of staff of the Kwantung Army, and had risen to become war minister. He was not an ideologue or a grand strategist, but an efficient administrator who believed that Japan's destiny required expansion and that the military must lead the way. When the emperor asked him to form a government with the charge to re-examine the decision for war, Tojo briefly considered alternatives, but ultimately concluded that war was inevitable. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was a more complex figure. He had studied at Harvard, had served as naval attaché in Washington, and knew America's industrial power firsthand. He had opposed the Tripartite Pact and had warned against war with the United States. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences," he reportedly said, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third year." But when the decision for war was made, Yamamoto devoted his genius to planning an operation that might give Japan the best chance of success. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was his conception, a bold stroke that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet and buy time for Japan to consolidate its conquests. Yamamoto hoped that a quick succession of victories would shock the Americans into negotiating. He was wrong. Emperor Hirohito presided over the decision for war, approving the plans brought before him by his military commanders. His role remains controversial. Some historians argue that he was a constitutional monarch who could not override the unanimous advice of his government. Others argue that he had the power to stop the war and chose not to use it. What is clear is that he sanctioned the attack on Pearl Harbor, just as he had sanctioned the operations in China and Manchuria before it. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong watched these developments with mixed feelings. Both hoped that American entry into the war would bring resources and relief to China. Both understood that their own rivalry would resume once the foreign enemy was defeated, and both knew that the war in China had already cost millions of Chinese lives, with millions more to come. As 1941 drew to a close, the countdown to Pearl Harbor began. On November 26, Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented Japan's ambassadors with what became known as the Hull Note, a demand that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina, abandon the Tripartite Pact, and recognize the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. To the Japanese, this was an ultimatum that required the surrender of everything they had gained over the past decade. It confirmed what the militarists had always believed. America would never accept Japan as an equal, would never recognize Japan's sphere of influence, would only be satisfied with Japan's humiliation. The decision for war had already been made. The strike force was already at sea. On November 26th, as the Hull Note was being delivered, a Japanese fleet of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and supporting vessels departed from Hirokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, sailing under radio silence toward Hawaii. On December 1st, an imperial conference formally declared war. The emperor sanctioned the decision. The operations would proceed. On December 7, 1941, December 8 in Tokyo, Japanese aircraft swept down on Pearl Harbor. Simultaneously, Japanese forces attacked Malaya, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Wake Island, and Guam. The Pacific War had begun. But the war in Asia had not begun at Pearl Harbor. It had begun 10 years earlier in Manchuria, when Japanese officers manufactured an incident that set their nation on a path of expansion and conquest. It had continued through the Marco Polo Bridge, through Shanghai, through Nanking, through years of grinding warfare in China. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not the start of Japan's war. It was the moment when Japan's war became a world war. The war in China would continue for 4 more years, parallel to the Pacific campaigns that drew more attention from American observers. China suffered terribly. Perhaps 15 to 20 million Chinese died during the war. Military casualties, civilian deaths from bombing and ground combat, victims of atrocities, and those who starved during the famines that the war caused. The Three Alls policy and other Japanese operations killed millions. The fighting between the Japanese, nationalists, and communists laid waste to vast areas of the country. But China did not surrender. For all its weaknesses, for all the corruption and inefficiency of Chiang's government, for all the internal conflicts that divided the Chinese resistance, China tied down over 1 million Japanese troops who could not be used in the Pacific. Chinese resistance bought time for the Allies to mobilize, to build the forces that would eventually defeat Japan. This contribution has often been overlooked in Western accounts of World War II, which focus on the Pacific island hopping campaigns and the atomic bombs. But as the historian Rana Mitre has argued, China was a forgotten ally, whose resistance was essential to Allied victory. Without China, Japan might have been able to concentrate all its forces against the United States and Britain. The outcome might have been very different. The war in Asia also shaped the post-war world. The Japanese invasions discredited European colonialism, demonstrating that the white colonial powers could be defeated. The nationalist movements that emerged during the war, in India, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, would soon demand independence. The Cold War in Asia, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War all had their roots in the conflicts of 1937-1945, and the war left wounds that have never fully healed. In China, the memory of Japanese atrocities, Nanking, Unit 731, the Comfort Women, the Three Alls, remains a source of intense nationalist feeling. In Japan, the war is still contested, with some conservatives denying or minimizing the atrocities, while others call for an honest reckoning with the past. The historical controversies that divide China and Japan today are the legacies of the war that began at the Marco Polo Bridge. The decision for war with the United States was the greatest strategic error in Japanese history. The militarists who led Japan believed that they had no choice. The oil embargo, they argued, left Japan with only 2 options: retreat or attack. They chose attack, gambling that a quick succession of victories would force the Americans to negotiate. But there was a third option: avoid the situation entirely. Japan could have refrained from occupying Indochina, could have sought a negotiated settlement in China, and could have avoided the actions that triggered the embargo. The militarists dismissed these alternatives as unthinkable, but they were possible. Japan's leaders chose war not because they had no choice, but because they could not imagine choosing peace. Admiral Yamamoto had warned that Japan could not win a prolonged war with the United States. He was right. American industrial production outstripped Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1. American resources were virtually unlimited. American manpower was inexhaustible. Once the initial shock wore off, once American industry mobilized for war, the outcome was never in doubt. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically but failed strategically. It united the American people for war as nothing else could have done. It transformed a nation that had been divided over intervention into one burning for revenge, and it brought into the war against Japan the full might of the world's greatest industrial power. The war that followed would be fought across the Pacific, from the Coral Sea to Midway, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. It would end with atomic bombs and unconditional surrender, with American occupation and the transformation of Japanese society. The empire that the militarists had built would be utterly destroyed. But all of that lay in the future on December 7, 1941. On that day, Japanese aircraft achieved complete surprise at Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships, destroying nearly 200 aircraft, and killing over 2,400 Americans. On that day, simultaneous attacks across the Pacific announced that a new war had begun, or rather, that Japan's long war in Asia had finally merged with the war in Europe to create a truly global conflict. One American diplomat, watching the events unfold from the vantage point of Shanghai, later wrote, "We had watched Japan's war in China for 4 years, the bombings, the atrocities, the endless campaigns. We had seen Nanking and its aftermath. We had wondered when, or if, our country would be drawn in. When the news came from Pearl Harbor, there was shock, but there was also a strange sense of inevitability. The war that had been consuming Asia had finally reached us. The 2 wars had become one. And we knew, with terrible certainty, that what we had witnessed in China was only a preview of what was to come. Next time, we will return to Europe, to the strange interlude known as the Phony War, when Britain and France were at war with Germany but not fighting. We will witness the Soviet invasion of Finland and the brutal Winter War that followed. And we will see Hitler turn his attention westward, preparing the offensive that will conquer France in 6 weeks and bring Nazi Germany to the height of its power." The world was now at war, in Europe and Asia, and soon across the Pacific. The Second World War had truly begun.